Liza Lawrence here with episode 28. This is where you need to be. Welcome to Wonders and Miracles podcast, where we celebrate miraculous moments in everyday lives. I'm your host, Liza Lawrence, a wife, mother, teacher, and miracle lover. If you're new to this podcast, this is what we do here. Each week on Miracle Monday, we celebrate awe-inspiring true stories from regular people like you and me. People who have experienced something surprising and wonderful that could be considered the work of a divine source. My desire is to help us recognize God's hand and His love in our lives, because the more miracles we notice, the more miracles happen. Thanks for listening to the show. Now let's celebrate wonders and miracles together. Luke chapter 15, 3 through 7. And he spake this parable unto them, saying, What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he lose one of them, doth not leave the 99 in the wilderness, and go after that which is lost, until he find it? And when he hath found it, he lay it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying unto them, Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost. So our episode today features the life-changing journey of Gavin Monteith. After his father's death, Gavin, age 15, turned to drugs and illegal activity to cope. For years of being immersed in darkness, severe alcohol and drug addiction, jail time, lost businesses, and lost relationships, how could Gavin possibly be reached? Through a series of spiritual encounters, including a message from his deceased father, meeting an elder from his church, Elder David A. Bednar, and the loving support of his family, Gavin finally had the strength to walk away from it all and into the light of God's healing grace and experience a mighty change. Thanks for joining in on this movement that miracles still happen. I'm really excited for you to hear Gavin's story. But first, a quick plug for one of my favorite books. It's called Hearts of the Fathers, written by my favorite writing professor, Sheldon Lawrence. This beautiful story takes us on a journey from darkness into light, from pain into the sweet joy of forgiveness. Inspired by the research of hundreds of near-death experiences, Hearts of the Fathers will truly change how you see this life and the life hereafter. It was one of the most satisfying books I've ever read. Here's what others have to say about it as well. Marley said, I thought I would be reading a book about life after death. I was consequently surprised when I found a book that has changed my desires and inspired me to really live. Another review, this is an Amazon customer, said, This book is life-changing, encourages self-reflection, and leaves you with a desire to be better. I couldn't put it down. And one more review from Heidi Lamcastle. She wrote, Excellent, excellent. The story, the characters, the events, moving, meaningful, and full of hope. This book raised me to a higher consciousness. It truly is an amazing book. You can find it on Amazon.com, or I have it on my website at wondersandmiracles.com on my sponsors page. So check that book out if you're in the mood for a life-changing book. I just wanted to share a quick little follow-up story from last week's episode. It was the story of Sharon, whose brother was killed in Vietnam. This was really a fun miracle that I didn't know until after the fact. So we had recorded Sharon's story a few weeks prior to airing it, and I told her that it would post sometime in February, and I wasn't sure the date yet. It was really interesting because I emailed her when I got all the editing done and put the show together and said it will be going live on Monday, February 18th. So this was last week. And she said, You're not going to believe this. She said she's been kind of stalling out on her book and not sure if she really should publish it. And she said to a friend, if the episode airs on February 18th, I know that I need to finish this book. Because on February 18th in 1968, that was the exact date that her brother died in Vietnam. Isn't that amazing? It was just another testament that the Lord is in the details. He knows what we each need at the perfect timing. So I just wanted to share that follow-up with you about Sharon's story last week. Also, shout out for the fan of the week. This is from G.R. Shelley, and she wrote in relationship to the episode A Child's Prayer, one of the earlier episodes. She said, "Loved hearing the incredible power of a child's faith and prayer. Love your podcast. Keep sharing these stories. They lift my heart." So thanks for that review. If you want to be the fan of the week, go write a review on iTunes and I'll read it on an episode. Thanks so much for your support. Now let's jump into Gavin's story. It's pretty amazing. All right, well, I'm here with Gavin today, and he's from Colorado, and he's going to share with us his transformational spiritual awakening from his teenage years to his late 20s. But it's a really remarkable story going from darkness into light, I feel like. Gavin, start us out from the beginning and then take us through your journey.
Well, from the beginning, it starts when I was really young. I grew up in a really well-organized family. My family was always really close to God, and it was a very tight family. I was a good student, good kid generally till I was about 15 years old. You know, I was an all-star athlete, straight A student, did a lot of positive things, had a lot of good friends, but my father was a police officer and was in the military. He was a command sergeant major in the military, and he had a very tight schedule. And our family was always ran very organized and very military style home, but it worked for us. When I was 15, my dad died when I was playing basketball with him at a church. My dad and I were really close. He was my football coach, coached basketball. You know, sports were a big part of it, but we were playing basketball one night at a gym and he had a massive heart attack. From that night on, my life had been a series of hit and runs. Self-destruction, drug abuse, streets, jail, drugs, the whole bit. You know, I started smoking pot at a young age. Even before my dad died, I was smoking pot a little bit, getting into a little bit of trouble, but nothing that I don't think I could have came out of. After he died, I just used his death and watching him die that night as an excuse. And I really fell deep into addiction and trying to make my pain or grief subside by, you know, using drugs and not paying attention to the things that I knew were right and real in my life. I went to Columbine High School, and he died when I was a freshman, halfway through my freshman year. And after that, I never really went back to class. I started ditching school and smoking pot on a regular basis and was starting to get into harder drugs. I started using meth a little bit after I was 16, and I ended up getting kicked out of Columbine halfway through my sophomore year for truancy to class and suspicion of selling drugs. I never got caught selling anything, but they knew that I was not in a good place and I wasn't a good student to be at Columbine. And that was 1998, the year before the Columbine shooting. So I got kicked out and I ended up going to an alternative high school, which wasn't good for me. But because of open enrollment laws, I was still able to play sports for Columbine when I was a teenager. And so while I was playing sports for Columbine and going to the alternative school, I was in and out of jail a lot. I had a very interesting relationship with my mother. After my dad died, she couldn't really control me. And so the only way that she knew how to try to show me tough love was calling the law. I spent a good majority of my teenage years in a juvenile detention center, on probation, that kind of thing. And when you're still using drugs and trying to manipulate the system by passing drug tests and things like that, it just doesn't really work out. My probation officer told me I wasn't able to play football my senior year. And so I quit going to school altogether, which was right after the Columbine shooting. And so I dropped out of school. That was a bad move for me. I didn't have any other option to support myself financially. At that point, I was almost 18 years old. My mom ended up kicking me out of my house right before I turned 18. And I lived with a friend's mom of mine for a little while and ended up just trying to support myself. So I was constantly selling drugs. I worked for a friend's dad of mine doing heating and air conditioning for a while. And this guy, Frank, was probably the closest thing that I had to a father after my dad. He taught me how to work, gave me a work ethic, but making $10 an hour, I couldn't support myself. So I was constantly trying to make ends meet. I ended up really getting deep into selling drugs and sold a lot of drugs with some friends of mine. And we ended up doing things that a lot of people only see in movies, making ridiculous amounts of money when you're 21 years old.
Like
And
what's ridiculous amounts? Give us a figure.
oh, I had friends of mine and they were making nearly 60 grand a month.
Wow.
Yeah. Doing things that were not legal. That was something that it was scary for a while, because when you're on that level, the type of people that you deal with are really not savory people. And I knew back then, because of the way that I grew up and the way that my faith was as a child, I knew my spirituality and the personality that I had, that I just wasn't cut out for that. The people that I worked with, they could do it. But I was always there as kind of the muscle, because I was big and strong and I was easy to protect people, and I could always help in times of violence, I guess. And so some of the violent things that happened and some of the reasons why I was able to cohabitate with those people was because of my athleticism and my size and strength. And so they used me where they could, and I made a lot of money for it. But that went on for till I was probably 24 years old. And I had a couple people in my life at that point. I lost a friend of mine when I was 18 to a car accident, and his mom was best friends with a guy named Thomas Barlow, who was an ice carver. And he just said, hey, you may like what I do. And so I worked with him on the side doing ice sculptures for a long time, and I just loved it. And even though I was doing other things, making big money on the side, I was still doing ice sculptures. And when you're driving nice cars and you're wearing nice jewelry and people ask you what you do, you tell them, oh yeah, I do ice sculptures. It was a nice little cover. So, but I did. I worked for him for a long time. And when I was 24, things kind of came to a head on the streets. I don't want to get into too much detail about that, but we basically had some things come to a big screeching halt. And one of my best friends ended up going to jail, did a prison sentence for us, and went to jail for 10 years. That was a big eye-opener. I had a big falling out with Thomas, the guy that I was doing ice from, and I ended up moving up to Fort Collins with a girlfriend of mine at the time. And I was living up there just doing nothing with my life. I was writing in a journal a lot, but just working in a restaurant, not really doing much. But that Christmas, my mom bought me my own set of chisels. At that time, I still had serious addictions. The drug addiction that I had to cocaine and ecstasy and meth even, I did a lot of meth because we always had it and it was cheap for us to do it. And so my addictions got to an elevated point where you can't support those kind of addictions without some type of financial backing. And when I moved up to Fort Collins, it was really hard for me. I still tried to sell a little bit, here and there just to kind of support my habits. And after that Christmas, when my mom bought me my chisels, I was like, I got to do something else with myself. So I moved back down to Denver and I started an ice sculpting company because I knew how to do it and I was pretty good at it. And I knew so many people from the things that I used to do that I would able to go to the club owners and party promoters and liquor companies and people like that I knew from being downtown spending money when I had it, that I really built a business downtown doing ice sculptures and did that for a really long time. Started my company in 2006, I believe. Worked well for a couple of years, made a lot of money, but still had these addictions. And when you're working in that kind of an environment, you're constantly out in the clubs and the party scene, and you're doing things in that environment where alcohol and drugs are just the norm. And it was hard for me to try to maintain a business and be that much of a cocaine addict. So I really got deep into meth, which was hard for me because I would be out all night drinking and doing cocaine and ecstasy and mushrooms and all these other drugs on a regular basis. And then having to get up the next day for meetings and going to the freezer doing ice sculptures and all this other stuff, where I had a hard time maintaining my lifestyle because I was doing meth all day and then drinking and cocaine at night. And then I'd go to bed for 4 or 5 hours, get up and do it all over again. And then days when I couldn't either get my drugs or I didn't have my drugs, I was miserable. I couldn't do it. I couldn't function. That went on for a while. And then the economy crashed in 2008 and my company tanked. It was hard because the first thing to go out of any type of party budget is an ice sculpture. Yeah. And so I had a hard time keeping my company afloat over the next couple years. And in 2009, my addictions were so deep. My company was struggling, and I felt like I was trading sculptures for things like bottle service and meals at restaurants and things like that than I was for actual money. And so I was having a hard time, and I started having these feelings about needing to change. There was a couple things that really happened to me one night. I was talking with a friend of mine. We had gone out, and then we'd come back to my apartment, and we were hanging out. We were doing coke and drinking, and I started talking to him about the way that I grew up and telling him about how my faith was always such a big part of who I was when I was a kid, and how the church that we belonged to and how God was, such a big presence in my life when I was young, but I just didn't feel it like it was anymore. And he asked me, he said, have you asked God what you should do?
Did you ever during those years, because you're going to talk about this question he asked you, but did you ever seek God at all during that time?
I always kind of knew that there was like something that I needed to do differently, but never really cared. It wasn't anything that was on a constant thought. I didn't have any type of connection to anything spiritual or God or anything. But when I was really struggling, I think when I hit my darkest, deepest points, when I was trying to be successful and trying to stay away from the streets and trying to be positive, with my ice sculpting company but I had these addictions that I just had to feed. Mm-hmm. And so I struggled with that a lot. And then when it came to a point where I knew that I was going to have to do something different, that's when strange things started to happen to me. Like the night that I was talking with my friend, he told me, he said, you might want to ask God what you should do. And at that point, I hadn't prayed in 10 to 15 years. I was probably 28 years old. And that night I went into my bedroom after he left, and I was drunk and high and seriously strung out. And I knelt down to pray, and I didn't know what I was doing. I still don't remember what I was praying about, but there was something that happened that night that to me was probably one of the scariest moments of my life, is that I knelt down to pray, was on my knees, and I was talking to God. I felt this negative energy up on my left shoulder. To put like a face to it, it felt like almost like an evil monkey, which sounds really stupid to hear it, but just like an evil monkey that was sitting up on my left trap, and I had my arms folded, and I remember trying to shake it off. Like my left shoulder, I kept on like trying to move it in circles and jig my head, and it wouldn't move. But I just remember this very real, negative, dark energy is the best way that I can say it. I don't ever remember closing my prayer or saying amen or anything like that. All I remember is the next morning waking up on my floor, fully clothed, shoes on still, to a light coming through my blinds in my window that were coming through and hitting my face. And I woke up and my body was so sore. And my left trap, where that was happening, was so sore that I couldn't even stand to move my left arm above my head. I felt like I'd been doing ice sculptures all day. My body was just so sore, but it was so weird. And so time went on where that just kind of got brushed under the rug. At one point in my life, I got a girlfriend of mine pregnant. I had always been very against abortion. She was a model and worked a lot with me, and she had a child already. And she didn't want to have another child because she said that she was afraid what it would do to her body. And I fought her all the way to the abortion clinic, and she just wasn't going to hear it. She got her mom to pay for it and went and had this thing. And that really shook me really bad. And I kind of fell back to my mom to help me because I was really broken. And my mom had me talk to some of the leaders from her church. We started talking on a regular basis. I had lost my place to live downtown at that same time period. And this was probably around August or September of 2009. We started talking with these spiritual leaders. I kind of told him about the story about that night that I prayed. And he told me, he said, you know that Satan will work harder on those that will be an advocate for God. And told me a story that kind of related a lot to that night for me. And it kind of made it real. And my mom and I and these leaders were sitting there. And my mom told me that one of the higher up leaders coming to talk to us in a couple of months. And I didn't even really know who he was. And so I just kind of brushed it off also. But I had a dream one night, not too long after that, where my dad had come to me. And it was a very real, very vivid dream. We were walking in this field. I could tell there was a football field in the distance, but it was more like a weeds field, which is really strange. But there was like a football field in the distance, which I didn't know if we were walking to or what was going on. But me and him were walking, and he was wearing a white shirt and these light gray pants, I think. And he said, Gavin, he said, I don't care if you're drunk, stoned, or strung out. He said, I want you at that meeting. And that's kind of a surreal thing where you have your dad that's been gone for nearly 15 years come to you in a dream and telling you you need to go listen to a church leader speak.
How did you feel when you had that dream? What were your thoughts with that?
I woke up and I just kind of sat there like, whoa. I remember that night I was sober when I had the dream.
Uh-huh.
And, a lot of the time when you have dreams and you're drunk or you're high or whatever, a lot of them are just kind of like, yeah, they happen, and you remember them, but you don't remember them. And this one was very, very real, very vivid. It was one of those spiritual moments where it kind of shocked me, just like the prayer, where I was like, whoa, something just happened. I don't know what, but that was something.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's when I told my mom that morning. I said, all right, Mom, I'll go to this conference where this guy's going to speak. She was excited. And so the day of that conference came, and I, of course, was out the night before, because it was on a Sunday, actually. And I was out the night before, and I went home to my mom's house, and I was drunk and high, and I woke up, sure enough, hungover and strung out at 9 o'clock in the morning. And my mom had gone early to save seats. And I walked in, and right when I walked into this church, I just started crying because I could feel a spiritual impact that I didn't fully understand. I do now, but I didn't understand then. And I instantly started crying right before I even hit the chapel. So when I walked in, I sat next to my mom. I was bawling my eyes out. My mom puts her arms around me, and I had this very strong impression to tell my mom that I needed to go to rehab. And she was crying herself. She was bawling her eyes out. And she said, okay. She said, Gavin, she said, we'll pay for the best one possible. And my older brother, who had always been really close to God and really close to his spirituality, was fully aware of the situation. He grabbed me and he said, hey, let's get out of here for a minute. Let you kind of catch your breath. I said, all right. So we got up out of the pew and we walked out, and we walked down this hallway where there's like hundreds of people lined up down this hallway. I mean, it's like packed. And I'm like trying to get outside because I can see a door, because I was fully aware of how I looked. I mean, I was a mess. Eyes are probably close to swollen shut. I'm in a shirt and tie, but I probably smelled like booze. And all this commotion starts, and this leader that my mom had invited me to come see had started to come out of this room. And all this commotion starts, and it looks like everybody's trying to see who it is and see where he's at. And I kind of tucked myself back in this corner, and I kind of kept my head down because I didn't really want anybody to notice me. And it seemed to me like things just kind of went quiet. And I looked up, and I swear to you, it looked like all these people just like moving out of the way for this little guy. And this church leader that we were there to listen to was a little fellow. And he walked right up to me and stuck his hand out and asked me what my name was. And I choked out my name, and all he said to me, he said 7 words that kind of changed my life and really impacted me, because he picked me out of a crowd of hundreds of people. And he said, this is where you need to be. And that's all he said. I mean, I'd hung out with famous people with my ice sculpting company. I'd done a lot of things around people that had that mantle, but not that mantle. It was different. And I'd never been starstruck like I was in that moment. And I knew that this man was somebody special, and that he found me for a reason. And it was very fortuitous for him to be there in that moment and spot me out of that crowd.
Yeah.
And after that day, there were a few things that I knew that needed to change with myself, and something was going to happen soon. And then New Year's Eve that year, I went out and I had a bunch of ice downtown, and I got paid like $1,400 cash for doing these ice sculptures. And I went out that night, and I still owed my freezer for the ice. I owed the guys that helped me. And I went out that night. I'd been drinking. I'd been doing drugs all day and night. Went to a strip club at 7 o'clock in the morning. And I don't know whether I was robbed or if I just lost this money, but I lost $1,400 cash. I had no money to pay anybody. We ended up going to a friend of mine's house who was actually really wealthy. And I asked him to borrow $20 for a cab so I could get back to my van. And he told me no. And I knew at that point in my life that if I have a rich friend of mine that is not willing to loan me $20 because I lost money, then something was wrong. And so I went home and I kind of thought about it for the next day. And my brother had come home from a spiritual mission that he was on for the church. And he was talking at church that day. And when I went in to his talk was the second time that I'd been in a church in a lot of years. First time was that day of that conference, and then the next day was to listen to my brother speak. And he said something that day that kind of started the tears, just like it did that day where I told my mom I needed to go to rehab. And he said in his speech, he said, looking at my brother Gavin here, he said, if I served for as long as I did for this church, and he's the only one that ever came closer to God because of it, he said, this will make it all worth it. And that day, after that meeting, I went home to my mom's house. and I shut my phone off and I shut my email down and I literally left my entire company that I had. I had a successful business. I knew that I needed to change. And I parked myself at my mom's house and I went through my own little personal rehab, and I didn't go anywhere for 3 weeks. So I went through intense, serious physical withdrawals where I almost landed in the hospital a couple of days. But there was one thing that I did do that kept me close, and that was I kept praying. And it seemed like every time I was praying that I would be able to go back to sleep, and I would be able to sleep through some of the physical agony that I was going through. And I did it. And I quit cold turkey. Everything that I was doing, I was a serious alcoholic and a cocaine addict and a meth addict. And I quit cold turkey. And I was lucky I didn't kill myself in the process, but I did it. And I did it because I knew that I was here for a better purpose, for a bigger reason. And now I'm grateful that I did, because I've got a wife and 3 beautiful children that I love more than anything in this world. I've got a college education now and a great job that I work at healthcare, where I'm hoping to one day potentially start a strand of drug and alcohol rehabs to help people where I was.
Yeah, that's just truly an amazing story. You can see how the Lord prompted people, and I'm sure your father was on the other side helping this process along this whole time, calling you back to God. You said that you felt like the reason you quit cold turkey is you had a bigger picture for yourself. You wanted to do more. Where do you think that came from? Like, how did you have that vision of bigger?
I've always been raised really close to my family, and my mom has always told me, I mean, even when I was a mess, she told me, she said, Gavin, you're intended for something bigger than this. She said, Gavin, what you're doing isn't what you're going to do the rest of your life. I hope you know that.
Hmm.
And she always told me, and it was kind of something, I don't know if it was called a brainwash or what you will, but it always stuck with me. And this sounds really weird, but I'm the second to youngest out of 6 kids, but I was the only one that was actually intentional by my parents. I was the only one that they said, yeah, we want to have a baby. And here I am.
Wow.
That was one thing. And then also my mom said that when I was in her womb, she said that I was the only one that she felt like she could feel my spirit that came from God. She said she never felt like that with any of the other kids, but she said that the spirit that I had was always really powerful and that she could feel that, which I don't really understand because I'm not a woman or I don't go through that, but that's something that she always told me. And that's always kind of stuck with me. And I've always felt that I've been a leader in one capacity or another. And so being put through and putting myself through what I went through, when I started to think about needing to change, that was kind of one of my thoughts on the forefront of my brain was, I have a better purpose than this, than what I'm doing. I have something bigger to offer than ice sculptures.
Yeah, that's a smart mom to teach her child to think that way. But I know what she's feeling because I have a child like that there was this spiritual connection, and he has struggled. Of all my children, he has struggled the most, which is interesting because sometimes you think perhaps that struggle strengthens.
I am a firm believer in that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But something else I noticed in your story is the grit to stick with something that you felt was important, such as getting off the drugs, and how hard that is. And I don't know personally, but the fact that you stuck with it really demonstrates the strength you do have, that innate strength within you. And of course, I'm sure you had heavenly help. You were praying, you were getting help and support, but that does demonstrate a very strong spirit.
Well, thank you. It wasn't easy. I know that. I experienced it firsthand. I knew that from those spiritual experiences that I had, I knew that God was trying to reach me on a different level.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that if I didn't answer him right then with all the stuff that had happened recently, that he may not try to knock anymore, or I may not be able to hear him. And so I knew at that point in my life that I needed to do it. And it was then, right now. And I'm glad I did.
Well, I know you have a lot to offer for sure. And it's beautiful to see how God called you. He reached through all of that and still was able to get to you. And I think that's a miracle. That really is amazing. Anything else you wanted to share that you learned through this?
Oh, I think that's the gist of it, but I'm grateful that you're able to use this and pass this on to your listeners, and it hopefully can help someone.
Yeah, I'm sure it will, because we have so many people in different walks of life that are struggling through different things. And I think it offers hope when someone has come out and has found God in that. So thanks for sharing your story.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Pretty remarkable. That's our show for today. I'm just always so amazed at how aware of us the Lord is. Few quick reminders. If you have a story you'd like to share on the podcast, just go to my website at wondersandmiracles.com and submit a story. I'd love to hear how God's shown up for you in your life. Also, I'd love your support in promoting the podcast. One of the best ways is to go write a review on iTunes, share it on your social media, and of course, show one friend this week how to find the podcast. And remember, if you're interested in a life-changing read, check out the book Hearts of the Fathers by Sheldon Lawrence. And I'd love to hear what you think about that book. Luke chapter 15, 3-7. And he spake this parable unto them, saying, What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he lose one of them, doth not leave the 99 in the wilderness, and go after that which is lost, until he find it? And when he hath found it, he lay it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying unto them, Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost. And of course, I hope that you can think of a time when you have been sought out by the Lord and rescued from your sins. And as always, remember to notice and celebrate the miracles everywhere, because the more miracles we notice, the more miracles happen